Your first time. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Brittany. If this is your first time to join us, we are the Gardner Institute. We've been around for 27 years. We're a nonprofit organization that was founded by John N. Gardner and Betsy O. Barefoot when they failed to retire from the University of South Carolina. And our work really focuses on partnering with colleges, universities, and other education organizations to really increase institutional responsibility for improving outcomes associated with teaching, learning, and completion. And what we really mean there is that rather than maybe a traditional quote unquote consulting group, what we really try to do is partner with our institutions, share processes, share different ways of approaching what some of the literature might refer to as wicked problems, and then try to design for improvement. So that is what curricular analytics is all about, and that's what the Gardner Institute is all about. Next slide, please. You only get me today. And I'm sorry for that because I work with some amazing colleagues on the Curricular Analytics Academy. Dr. Steph Foote, Dr. Rodier, and Ethan Campbell all serve our institutional partners as they're working through curricular analytics. I joined the Gardner Institute, goodness gracious me, about 6 years ago when I had been working at an institution that had been partnered with the Gardner Institute for a number of years, doing gateway course redesign, retention work, and that work was incredibly inspiring. And when the opportunity to partner more directly with the Gardner Institute came up, I jumped on it. And it's hard to believe, but the curricular analytics work really, Steph and I started partnering on that almost at the same time. And I think it took us about a year, year and a half to get everything squared away. And so excited to share more about that and look forward to you meeting the rest of the team soon. So this was an article in the Chronicle of Higher Education talking about some of our early work in curricular analytics. And the question that was being posed was, is your degree plan or your degree program too complicated? And Dr. Greg Heileman and Dr. Shawi Abdullah were two folks who really pioneered curricular analytics work alongside the Gardner Institute almost a decade ago. Um, and and this work really, I mean, the answer is yes, it probably is overly complicated. Occasionally, we run into programs where there's very low complexity, but in fact, sometimes in those cases, the low complexity, which is all calculated by prerequisite and co-requisite relationships, and I'll get more into that in just a minute. But the low complexity ends up leading to um, maybe not too much student choice, but sort of a lack of clear pathways for students. And so, what curricular analytics really does is it gives you both a process by which to investigate and interrogate your curriculum, but also a way to make certain curricular structures that might have historically been invisible visible to your team so that you can do some analysis. Next slide, please. So what you can expect for curricular analytics in the academy, it's 7 synchronous meetings. And that means they're all virtual meetings. You can invite your team to those, and if you miss them, they're all recorded. They're loaded into our learning management system. But in addition to that, you get access to Brandon and Steph and Rob and Ethan to support you and your team as you're going through the self-study process with curricular analytics. So as you're building maps, as you're interrogating those maps, as you're working through root cause analysis and making diagrams, our team is happy to meet every step of the way to support that work. And I think that is really frequently when the magic happens, is when we meet with institutional teams and really start to dig into why certain structures exist and what's within the locus of control of the faculty and staff and what the faculty and staff might need help with from other folks at the institution. So you'll have the learning management system that I mentioned earlier, which has, assignments, and I call them assignments. It's really just guided self-study that we chunk out based on improvement science methods. And then you'll also have access to our platform, which I will demonstrate in just a few moments. But next slide, please, while we wait on that, because that's what everybody wants to see is the cool toys. So the approach. This is just high level how we look at this work. So if you're familiar with Ed Deming's work or improvement science methods or Lean or Six Sigma, or you've worked in engineering, then you may be familiar with this notion of plan, do, study, act. And for us, the first step is really visualizing so that you can make a plan so that everyone on your team can see the same story. Um, so we start off with some orientation on what curricular analytics are, and then we help you with your data upload. We've gotten pretty darn good at scraping those data for our institutional partners using we actually have trained up some artificial intelligence to help us with that. So if you got publicly facing um, curricular plans, specifically a catalog is probably the best thing that's either in a PDF or a CSV file that you can share with us. We can very quickly help you build out your catalog or excuse me, your visualizations. And historically, that was one of the hardest things about this because it takes, about an hour to do it by hand to build a program of study. Now we can do it in seconds. And I'll show you some other cool things that we can do in just a minute. Oh, one more back. I'm sorry, I wasn't quite ready. Just the other things I'd like to point out down at the bottom where it says problem identification, visualizing the system. These are sort of the topics for those synchronous meetings. And for all of them, there is some artifact, some deliverable that you can bring back to your colleagues at your institution to sort of share the story about what you're learning and what actions you think are required to help advance student success in your programs of study. So the idea behind this is that everything you do can be directly delivered to your team, other faculty, um, you know, whatever structures you have at your institution related to deciding curriculum, that it can go straight to them. So the hope is that it's very practitioner focused. Next slide. So now I get to show you the curricular analytics. But before I do that, I just want to say some things that I think I may have already said. But I designed many years ago when I was a program chair because I was on faculty at a state school and then at a private institution. And when I designed my own program of study, I had a 4-year grad rate in the 80th percentile. Every student in that program went to graduate school or got a job in the industry at graduation. I thought the curriculum were well designed until I put it through this process. And what this process revealed for me was things that were hidden from me. Things like the fact that certain types of students didn't do as well in some of our classes. And specifically, one of the big aha moments for us for our grads was that transfer students could not navigate our program in just 2 additional years. It was impossible. And so learning that, even though I'd already left my institution, I shared that back with my colleague who was then the program chair, and she made some changes based on that learning. So, you know, I thought I knew my curriculum really well, but I learned some things when I was able to see how they were structured, see how students were experiencing some of the ways that we had designed the coursework, and it gave us some paths in to help different students navigate this more effectively and hopefully in less time. So next slide. We talk a little bit about systems, subsystems, and even bounded systems, right? A program of study is a bounded system. It sort of has a beginning and an end, and that allows us to study it. And then we can sort of look at that in conjunction with other systems like graduate school or transfer or the gen ed or other areas. But this systemic approach allows us to look at areas where you, as a resident expert, can identify problems, things you don't care for, related to outputs in student success, and then ask yourselves, what are the causes? Which of these causes are within our locus of control, and which do we need help with? And that is sort of the secret sauce of the first step of improvement science. Next slide, please. Okay, this is where if you haven't seen curricular analytics before, um, this is where it starts to get interesting. So rather than read a slide to you, I would like to take you into our actual platform. So I may need Katie to allow me to share my screen. Any questions in the chat, Katie, while I pull up the demo site? Nothing yet? I know I'm moving pretty quickly here. You're muted, Katie. Sorry.
Of course I am. I just said the most interesting thing ever. We did have a question, and you in advance about partnering. It was from a 2-year school interested in maybe partnering with a 4-year school on transfer. So
Cool.
you may think about that as you
Yeah, I
share.
will. I promise I'll show some stuff on that. So this is our platform space. Anything you load here is for your eyes only, right? So even though my view, I can see because I'm a super user, every institution we work with on this, your institution will have its own spot, and anything you load there will essentially belong to you all. It's your own platform space. When you get into this space, you'll see that there's a curricula tab, and I'm going to just go to some of my favorite examples. Um, so let's talk about what's here and what this program really does for you. So this is a program of study. It's actually an accounting major. Um, some quick things you can see. You can see how many credits are in the major. And you see this number, this complexity score, and I'll get more into that in just a minute. But I want to say now and forever that complexity is neither good nor bad, but it is correlated with certain student success outcomes. So there are a number of publications that show that as we address curricular complexity, student success in a few areas tends to increase. So those areas are, in no particular order, uh, retention, time to graduation, um, uh, uh, excess credit accumulation, so and then graduation rates overall. So those four areas are four areas that as you start to address some of this curricular complexity, a lot of times you'll see increases in those four sort of lagging student success metrics. Now, why is that? Well, let's dig into what's actually in this graph, right? So that's all this is. This is a graph with nodes, circles that are courses, and edges, lines that show prerequisite relationships. And we move from left to right, term 1 to term 8, on a 4-term degree plan. So, how do we get to complexity measures? Well, I'm going to zoom in here. These are the 4 measures of curricular complexity. The first is the blocking factor. How many classes does this class block because of a prereq? This class blocks only one. I choose this one on purpose because it's pretty pretty easy to see. The delay factor is how many terms on the longest chain associated with this. So how many potential stops does a student have where if they either are misadvised, they're not able to take the course because it's full, or they've got work obligations, or because they don't pass the course, they enter D, failure, withdrawal, incomplete. That could delay or add a term to their degree. So how many of those? And the problems arise with delay factors when those chains start to get really long. We frequently see degrees where there are 6, 7, 8 terms. And then when you factor in course rotation, well, then a student who missteps in any way or has circumstance keep them from staying on track it can really cost them both in time and money. So those are the first two areas, and you'll notice that if you add 2, the delay factor, and 1, the blocking factor together, you get the complexity. Centrality is a little different. For centrality to work, and if you're interested, we can show you the math behind this. We've got some papers about it, but centrality is really about roads in and roads out. And when a course has high centrality, it means that after a student completes this course, right? And central, again, you got to have something feeding in for it to be central and something on the other side of it. It can't be a terminal node, as we call it. Um, but like this accounting 301 class has higher centrality because it actually opens up, if a student passes it, access to a number of other courses. A student automatically gets access to 3 classes right after that. And then those classes then have some prereq relationships. But these are the 4 metrics of curricular complexity. And it's really interesting because as cool as this little map is, it gets even cooler when you create a copy and then you decide to do some what if scenarios. So in some really complex courses, you could say, well, what happens if I move this course over here to this other term? Well, it changes the complexity of this third term. You may not want to do this. Now the third term is the highest complexity term in the major. Well, why is it the highest complexity term? We literally add the complexity, the relationships, those metrics from each of the courses in the column to get the complexity. Again, the reason all that matters, just shorthand, is because when you have a really high complexity term, it means there's a lot at stake for the students who are taking this. And if every course this term has a prereq relationship and the student makes any mistake, they could have a problem there. So a lot of times it's advantageous to actually move that complexity around a bit so that it's better distributed, so that maybe there's not quite as much at stake in any one term. A lot of times, once the student passes whatever the highest complexity term is, usually in the sophomore or junior year, they're a lot more likely to retain. The other way to look at it is when they pass some of these high centrality courses, they're a lot more likely to retain and graduate. So this is the tool in a nutshell. You can create copies. You can do a lot of different things. Another cool thing you can do here is view and list. So if you and your team are trying to make sense of all this, you can say, well, what are our highest complexity scores? And you can just filter and say, okay, well, I guess it's accounting 284, 301, 386, and then comms, and it starts to sort of, fall off here, although you keep having some pretty high complexity. What's our highest centrality? Accounting 386. I'll bet you dollars to donuts that students who pass accounting 386 graduate, right? Or have a much, much higher rate of graduation than those who don't make it to this course. And same thing with blocking factor and delay factor. This 9 delay factor, right? That's a problem. That means on this 284 chain, there's no room. And there's actually a double up where you've got a co-rec there. And then the delay, oh, excuse me, that was the blocking factor. The delay factor is the one I'm should. So there's a 6-term delay factor across quite a few courses. So, in a nutshell, this is the first level of study, a program. But let's look really quickly, if folks are okay with it, at what happens when we look at transfer. So many moons ago, we did a transfer study with some colleagues in California, and recognized that there were some real challenges. I shouldn't say challenges. There were some real differences in the way transfer students experienced curriculum versus first time, full time at a 4-year institution. They've since made lots of changes, so this is all old. But an example here is that variable calculus is taken at this 2-year institution in the first term. They want them to get math out of the way in case they might need to retake it or something else. But look how many terms until that knowledge is applied again. 1, 2, 3. So essentially 3.5 years here. And then this is actually a really complex summer term, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then another term here. So 3 years before we apply our math in context within our major at a completely different institution. They talked about that and said that wasn't desirable. But we started to see these structures a lot too. These are called complexity walls. These are courses that for a first-time full-time student at this 4-year institution would probably be over here somewhere because there's only one course, a course that's normally taken in the second or third term, blocking them from OChem. But for these students who transfer in, The only way for them to finish in 2 years is to take two summer courses um, leading up to their matriculation of OChem. And if they don't pass these, they can't access any of this. Uh, this was not desirable. Similarly, this course, again, like having this course taught here to allow students to access all of this, if there were just a lot of problems. So I bring this up to say um, this is a powerful tool to understand how a first-time full-time student and a transfer student, even with clean articulation agreements, might be experiencing complexity very different ways. Because in short, for the transfer, the complexity really migrates to that first or second term where they only have a few choices for courses. They're all really high stakes. And again, it happens this term, this term, this term. So they have lots of high stake terms back to back. And that can really extend time to graduation if there's any kind of misstep. The last and newest version of this work is the gateway course analysis. And this is a pretty simple one. It's looking at college algebra. We wondered about a year and a half ago what would happen if we applied this model, not not having the unit of measurement be a program, but instead have the unit be one course across all programs. So a course like algebra, how does it block access to other courses across every major at the institution? In this case, and this one's pretty small, we've been doing some work on calculus where it's 200 plus courses that are blocked by calculus. But in this case, 24 courses are blocked across 6 terms across multiple majors. And what we've started doing is combining this with a matrix that we build for our institutions that give them some granular views of what's the first course, what are the next courses, major, major, major. So you can really dig in there, and I can pull that up if folks are interested. But these are really the 3 main ways that we encourage our institutions to integrate their curriculum using the curricular complexity maps. I'm going to take another breath because I covered a whole lot. And that's not the right slide deck. I might pass it back to Katie because I thought I had it up right there and I don't. Still no questions. Keep on rolling, Katie Locke. I'll be quick. Talked about that already. Here we go. So these are just some examples of how this has been used. And I will tell you, we kind of cherry picked some of these just to show you that it's not just for STEM. Because if you look at the literature, you see a lot of application for this for engineering, for science and math, for high complexity nursing. But you can also use it for other programs of study. We did some writing about history, but I'll just quickly talk through this. We had an art program that realized they had unnecessary curricular complexity. They had what we call legacy prereqs, where it had made sense for a course to be a prereq many moons ago, but maybe now it didn't. Maybe now it was creating an artificial filter. They also found that the only way to graduate was to repeat some upper level courses. So they took care of that, but they learned a lot of that through their analysis. They had a new program chair, and she did a whole lot, and within 6 weeks, 8 weeks, had a report that she was able to deliver at the state level to change those degree requirements. Engineering is really common. If you're interested, you should look up Nathan Klingbeil. He did a great TED talk on some of the work that he did related to curricular analytics. But we had one engineering program that essentially found that some historically resilient communities were not retaining, not graduating from their program, and overall persistence rates were really low. So they changed some of their advising tools, and they actually moved some of their courses around based on the maps. They also added some new measures for student readiness in some of the courses, similar to Klingbeil's Engineering 101, where they were teaching math in sort of context within the program. Um, And they just developed some new coursework to minimize travel because they were finding that students weren't taking courses because they literally couldn't get from point A to point B in time because of a distributed campus issue. So again, like all of that came out of looking at these maps and working through our self-study. Next slide, please. A couple more examples. Bio is a really common one because biology, like I just showed you a moment ago, is complex. Some of those courses absolutely have prerequisite learning and knowledge in them. So how do we design the rest of the curriculum around some of those courses or support systems for students so that they can navigate some of these tricky spaces? This institution had some retention concerns around it, especially completion, which obviously go hand in hand. But here they learned that what they found in one of their bio majors applied to almost, they had like three or four others, and they realized that it applied to all of them. So they made these changes pretty sweeping because the same faculty engaged in this study of the one bio program taught in some of the others as well. But here they removed some unnecessary prereqs. They actually clarified some advising. They learned while they were doing their five whys protocol with some of their faculty and advisors that some folks were actually using outdated and incorrect advising materials, and so they busted some myths there related to prereqs. And then they also learned which courses they wanted to connect their academic support folks and faculty with so that they could really be strategic about how they supported students. And then the last and not always the most pleasant to talk about is this idea of like how do we make campus-wide decisions about consolidating programs or ensuring that learning in a gen ed is scaffolded or aligns the way we want it to. So there are lots of different ways to use it, for sort of non-traditional ways of looking at how we can move learning outcomes across different programs, combine courses. And again, because of the what if scenarios and the fact that you can create lots of copies of these maps, it's just a really handy tool when you're trying to deal with very challenging problems of practice. Next slide, please. Oh goodness. So we've got some cool curricular analytics use cases on our website, but then we've also done some other scholarship on this front. I've talked a little bit about it already, so I won't bother you too much. But this book is coming out pretty soon, and we've got a chapter in here. Greg Heileman, one of our fellows, is a co-author on it, and it's got some really great use cases and examples of how this works. And it hasn't quite yet hit the book racks at your local bookstore, but it should be available soon. I think I haven't gotten my copy yet, but hopefully get it soon. Steve just reached out, I think last week. But there's quite a bit of scholarship on this front. Happy to send it your way if you're interested, because honestly, our team has written an awful lot of it.
Yeah, I
Next
think it's
slide,
supposed to come
please.
out in early September.
Okay, great.
So soon.
Soon, soon. So who might want to do this? Typically, it's faculty and staff from programs. Sometimes it's somebody from academic affairs, a dean, department chair. It really depends. Occasionally, it's folks from areas like admissions, or we have, I would say one of our some of our most amazing, colleagues who've worked in this space and done some really amazing things have been folks in registrar positions, folks who work in, other institutional research positions, who decide they want to help faculty see the challenges of student success through this lens. So lots of different folks. Typically, teams are about five people, up to 15. And the hope is that if you bring folks who can learn the process, they can teach others how to use these tools because the tools can be shared broadly at the institution. We want to make sure that we have enough resources to give your team sort of the one-on-one during that 7 to 8 week period of the Curricular Analytics Academy. So that's part of why we limit. But again, like if we need to meet with other groups, happy to do that. We just want to make sure that the course size doesn't get too huge so that we don't have time to meet with everybody. Here are the dates of the meetings this year. If for some reason you can't make one of these, like I said, we have videos that we get put on the LMS. There are guidebooks for everything. And then you also have access to our team. So if for some reason the scheduling is a challenge, let us know, and we'll do our best to support your team.
And Brandon, it's these seven synchronous sessions, and then there are meetings.
Yep. Yeah, we have meetings after that sort of as needed. So typically about every 6 to 8 weeks, we'll say, hey, everybody come on. But in addition to that, Katie, because we want you to share out sort of how things are going. That's why we have those follow-up meetings, is so you can hear what other folks in your cohort were doing. You can share out, successes or challenges you're facing in the larger group. But if you need that one-on-one support from our team, we actually have a link that you can use at any time. And you can either say, I'd really just like to meet with Steph, or I'd really like to meet with Ethan, or some combination of the group. Or you can even just say, I'll take the next available person from this group of 4 people. And so you can see every available time.
Excellent.
Somebody asked if we'll do it in the spring. Absolutely. I don't know if we have those dates published yet, but we should have them shortly.
Yeah, yeah. We'll usually start at the end of January, beginning of February. So once we have those dates confirmed, and you all may have them, Brandon, and I don't know that yet, but we'll get those on our website when we have a confirmation.
Absolutely.
Right.
Unless
This is always my, I'll talk about the fees. So there are, of course, fees associated with this. The fees are based on your undergraduate enrollment as determined by College Navigator. Um, One of the things I always like to emphasize is that those fees can be split into 2 fiscal years to make the fees a little easier to work into a budget. And always don't let the fees be the reason not to work with the Gardner Institute. If it feels difficult, just reach out and we'll do our best to see how we can accommodate you.
It's also worth pointing out that if your institution is a transformation participant, right? If you're participating in our transformation work, that you've already paid your fee. Transformation is I joke. I shouldn't say. I don't know that anybody else says it, but I frequently say it's like having a gym membership. You don't have to use all the weight machines, and you don't have to use all the different equipment, but you have access to everything we do if you're a transformation institution, at no additional cost. So all our processes, academies, unless there's travel involved, it tends to be covered. So let us know if you have any questions. If you're a transfer school, you'll probably want to talk to your relationship manager, but you can also chat with us here, and we'll make sure that that person is in contact.
Definitely. We do like to stop and mention that we do have an annual symposium. This year it is October 14th and 15th in Indianapolis. If you are the academy is a team opportunity. If you are an N of one at your institution and you really want to delve into this, we do have the track here on curricular transparency and complexity, where you get the opportunity to use the tool. Sometimes people bring one or two, maybe people who might be a little skeptic, and they get the chance to sort of experience it and see the tool, and then understand if they want to go on into the academy. So definitely, if you're interested in that, all of this information will be shared with you in the follow-up email. But go ahead, Brandon. You look like you
I
had
was just
something
going
to
to say,
say.
if you choose to do the curricular analytics, the curricular transparency and complexity track, um, we will literally take you get to, I think, upload 1 or 2 programs of study, and we will load that for you, make that visualization present, and you will be able to go through some of the first 2 or 3 steps of that work and leave the meeting with a plan of action when you get home. And we usually leave it open for a while for participants, so you still have access to the maps and can engage with your faculty and staff when you get back. So it's a way to really sort of jumpstart the process if you're interested.
Absolutely. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing and give you all the opportunity to ask any questions. Brandon, do you want to talk a little bit about how people have used this with for transfer students?
Yeah, so I showed the transfer map earlier, but you know, my deep recommendation is to do one of two paths, if whether you're a 2-year or a 4-year institution that's interested in this. So you can do it from either direction. Um, but either A, start off with some programs and some institutions that you know you have a relationship with, where you're getting a lot of students or you're sending a lot of students, and see if they want to join up with this. Because it's really meaningful to go through this process alongside one of your like with your fellow institutions, so that the faculty from both places can talk, so staff, who are on the transfer team can talk. But if that's not possible, or you want to get a jump start because there's some complexity there, the other path that we really recommend and we've seen good success with is one of those, whether you're the 2-year or the 4-year institution, doing this work, building the maps, and then bringing those maps to the table when you're having a conversation with the sender or the receiver. So you're able to say, "Hi, I would really like to talk with you about our transfer ecosystem, and I'd like to show you some things we've learned." And that's another way into this, that sometimes we've seen really catalyze conversations and open doors that might have previously not been open. So there's more than one way to get into it, either in partnership or with the intent to bring the information to your friends and colleagues at other institutions to figure out how you can design clearer pathways for those transfer students. Because if you've worked in that space, um, it is a rare thing for an institution to say that the transfer ecosystem is just dialed in and perfect. It's a hard space. And there's a lot of lost credit. There's a lot of extended time to graduation. And that's hard for students who typically have already had a circuitous path towards whatever their, postgraduate goals are.
Thank you. And Brittany, who's helping us out behind the scenes, has said that you all are now able to turn on your um, video camera and unmute if you'd like to ask a question live. If you would like to not have a question recorded, we can also stop the recording and let you ask your question so it's not saved for all to see. So I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.
That's always nice.